In the rolling hills of rural New England, the Rowe estate stood apart from the surrounding farmland. Its stone walls and shuttered windows appeared innocuous by day, but as the sun sank low, casting long shadows across the grounds, the house took on a different presence. Locals whispered its name only in passing, eyes dropping, voices hushed. Children were warned not to stray near the edge of its gates, and even travelers passing the main road felt a tightening in the chest, a sense of being watched. To any casual observer, it was simply an old family estate maintained with care, but those who knew its history, or part of it, spoke of the red door, always locked, always silent, always forbidden. They told the servants never to open it. Nathaniel Rowe, the master of the house, was a man who inspired quiet awe. He dressed impeccably, greeted visitors with polite smiles, and spoke in a calm, measured tone. Outsiders would never suspect the darkness that thrived behind his composed exterior. There were no screams that could be heard, no chaotic violence, no sign that the walls themselves might conceal horrors. Yet within the estate, the air carried a subtle weight, as if each corridor, each staircase had been trained to enforce obedience. Servants moved quietly, their eyes darting to the red door as they passed, fingers brushing over walls as if afraid they might disturb some unseen force. Even the gardens seemed deliberate in their stillness. Flowers were pruned with mechanical precision, fountains trickled with ritualistic regularity, and paths were arranged not for convenience, but to channel the movement of those who dwelled there. Visitors who lingered in the estate's parlor sometimes felt unease, a gentle, persistent suggestion that something vital was missing from the room's symmetry. Nathaniel observed them closely, noting not just what they did, but how they responded, how fear or curiosity or discomfort subtly altered behavior. Everything was catalogued, remembered, stored for a purpose beyond ordinary comprehension. It was a quiet tyranny, one that suffocated without violence, that left its marks in small, imperceptible ways. Servants spoke of odd instructions: polish the silver 3 times in a row, stand in a particular spot while greeting guests, never turn your back when he entered a room. Each rule was arbitrary, yet deviation was met with silent, penetrating disapproval, a look that could unsettle the strongest stomach. And always, there was the red door, looming behind a curtain of shadows at the end of the main hallway. Locked, bolted, hidden by design, it was a presence rather than a barrier, a symbol of the unknowable. Some nights, neighbors swore they could see flickers of light behind the drawn curtains of the estate, shadows moving in ways that seemed almost deliberate, almost intelligent. Others reported hearing footsteps where none could have walked, or the faint echo of a child's cry on the wind. No one dared investigate, but every story, every whisper fed into a growing narrative. This house was alive with secrets, and the man who lived there understood those secrets intimately. He held the house, the servants, and perhaps even the surrounding land in a delicate balance of control, observation, and subtle menace. By dusk, the estate appeared almost serene, the weight of its presence softened by the evening light. Yet for those who had seen or heard too much, serenity was an illusion. It was the calm that comes before a slow, inescapable revelation, the first impression of a mind capable of methodical, hidden cruelty. Nathaniel Rowe would greet the night like any other evening, polite and attentive. But behind the locked red door, A world unknown to outsiders, yet meticulously ordered and fearfully alive, waited for the curious, the careless, and the unlucky. Life within the Rowe estate moved according to a rhythm that outsiders could never see. The servants knew it intuitively, though few could articulate it without faltering. Abigail, newly arrived from the village, quickly learned that the house demanded more than labor. It demanded vigilance, obedience, and silence. She had grown up in a modest household, accustomed to hard work, but nothing had prepared her for the subtle, suffocating hierarchy imposed by Nathaniel Rowe. Every glance, every word, even the absence of sound, carried weight. To falter was not merely a mistake, it was an invitation for scrutiny. From the moment Abigail entered, she was reminded of the red door. It loomed at the far end of the hall, a crimson rectangle hidden behind velvet curtains, a boundary she was forbidden to approach. "Never open it," the headmaid whispered, her voice low, trembling. "We have an oath. We obey or we vanish." The words meant to warn did more than that. They etched fear directly into the corners of her mind. Every step she took in the house, every turn along the polished corridors was shadowed by the thought of that locked door. It was a presence in its own right, a silent authority, a reminder of the consequences of curiosity. Nathaniel's rules were precise, often arbitrary, yet meticulously enforced. The servants were expected to clean in sequences he dictated, to polish the silverware twice and then again in exact patterns, to fold linens to an angle he found satisfying. Deviation was rare and punished not by voice or gesture, but by an invisible weight of judgment, a stare that could unsettle the mind. Abigail realized quickly that Nathaniel was observing far more than her work. He was cataloging expressions, measuring reactions, noting hesitation. His intelligence was surgical, his attention unyielding. Even a whisper of doubt could be detected, and the silent penalty was almost worse than any physical rebuke. Within this environment, stories circulated of past servants who had failed. One young boy had dared to peek at the red door. He was never seen again. Another had questioned a rule and the next morning had disappeared from the village entirely. No one could explain their absences, and the mystery fed the fear that shaped daily life. Servants learned quickly that obedience was not merely practical, it was survival. They memorized the pathways, the acceptable gestures, and the silent language of compliance. Every small infraction was a potential spark, every act of independence a threat to be extinguished. Abigail also discovered Nathaniel's habit of cataloging obedience and fear in astonishing detail. He maintained ledgers and journals, not just of household accounts, but of emotional states. He measured how long a servant's hands trembled while polishing silver, how their eyes darted when they thought he might be watching, and how subtle shifts in posture betrayed inner tension. In this, he was both a meticulous scientist and predator, turning human responses into a system of rules and consequences. The red door, though locked, was a constant reference point, a symbol of ultimate control, a promise that curiosity could lead to disappearance or worse. Over time, the servants began to speak among themselves in hushed tones, sharing fragments of knowledge, pieces of observation that Nathaniel did not notice. They warned each other about patterns, about gestures and whispers that hinted at his hidden cruelty. Abigail learned that survival was not just about obedience. It was about understanding the structure of fear, anticipating scrutiny and never ever trusting that normalcy equaled safety. Even meals were regimented. A spoon out of place or a plate slightly askew could earn a look so cold it chilled the marrow. The oath, unspoken yet universally understood, bound the household together in quiet desperation. No one could speak of the red door beyond the walls of the estate. No one could question its secrecy, and no one could act without inviting scrutiny. Abigail began to feel the psychological weight pressing down upon her. A slow tightening that left her alert, anxious, and aware that every thought could betray her. Nathaniel's genius lay not in overt violence, but in the control of perception itself, the shaping of reality to fit his meticulous hidden designs. The house became more than a home. It was a crucible, a laboratory, a stage on which obedience and fear were measured, catalogued, and ultimately perfected. By the end of her first week, Abigail understood what the others already knew. Survival was a matter of silence, observation, and careful compliance. The red door, locked and silent, was a daily reminder that the house belonged not to them, but to Nathaniel Rowe. And the oath whispered among servants was both a warning and a lifeline, an invisible contract that tethered them to life itself. Behind a narrow door tucked away in the west wing of the Rowe estate, Nathaniel had created a space unknown even to most of his servants. The room was a workshop of meticulous order, filled with the scent of varnish, sawdust, and something subtler, more pungent, that clung to the edges of perception. A metallic tang, faint but persistent. Abigail had heard rumors from the older servants about the crafting room, but none had dared speak openly. Nathaniel called it simply his workshop. To him, it was an extension of his mind, a place where observation, control, and artistry intersected. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves, each holding dolls in various stages of completion. At first glance, they appeared ordinary. Porcelain faces with glass eyes, jointed limbs, delicate hands. But the closer one looked, the more disturbing the details became. Each doll bore subtle traces of reality, not merely imagined likenesses, but evidence of study, of time spent watching and recording. The dolls reflected not only human form, but human psychology. The curl of a finger revealing anxiety, the tilt of a head hinting at doubt, the frozen smile that carried undertones of fear. Nathaniel worked with an almost clinical precision, capturing not merely appearance but essence. Abigail's first glimpse of the workshop came on a morning when she had been assigned to dust the West Wing. She had moved quietly, following routine, when a faint tapping sound drew her toward the narrow door. A brass key, cold and heavy, hung from a ribbon around Nathaniel's neck, and for a fleeting moment he allowed her to enter the room. Her eyes widened as she took in the meticulous array of dolls, each one seated on a miniature chair, each one positioned with obsessive attention to detail. There was an unnatural stillness to the space, as though the dolls themselves observed her, cataloging her presence with silent scrutiny. Nathaniel spoke softly, almost conversationally, explaining that each doll was more than a toy. They were exercises, experiments in observation and replication. Abigail noticed the subtle variations. Some dolls had eyes slightly too large, others mouths twisted in micro-expressions of discomfort. He demonstrated on a new creation, carving joints with a scalpel-like precision, adjusting the angle of a hand so that it suggested hesitation. He showed her how to measure and record minute details of human posture and expression, teaching her to replicate subtle emotional cues in the dolls. The process was technical, methodical, and utterly mesmerizing. But soon Abigail began to notice the darker undertones. Nathaniel would select a particular servant and observe them for hours, noting patterns of fear, small reactions to his gaze or words, the way limbs moved when anxiety took hold. Then in the workshop, he would replicate these subtleties in the dolls. A new doll might have a finger bent at the exact angle of tremor, a smile mimicking the tension of suppressed fear, eyes reflecting hesitation. The dolls became records, living documents of human response, a way to preserve behavior, fear, and obedience outside of the body itself. Abigail's unease grew as she realized the workshop was also a mechanism of power. Each doll represented knowledge, surveillance, and control. To create a doll of someone was to own a piece of them, to anticipate reactions, to understand vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The process was silent, invisible, and yet devastatingly effective. Nathaniel's cruelty was not immediate or obvious. It was latent, psychological, and profound. The dolls were extensions of his will, instruments of observation that allowed him to study and manipulate the household with surgical accuracy. Occasionally, Nathaniel would whisper to Abigail about potential enhancements, ways to capture not only physical likeness but emotional resonance. He suggested experiments, leaving a doll in a servant's quarters to provoke unease, adjusting expressions to see if behavior changed, noting patterns that emerged over days or weeks. The idea that a simple porcelain figure could induce anxiety, shape obedience, and extract fear seemed absurd, and yet Abigail saw it happen. The dolls were not mere playthings, they were tools, silent agents of control, embodiments of a mind that measured and exploited human vulnerability with unwavering precision. By the end of her first month, Abigail understood that the workshop was the heart of Nathaniel's hidden genius and cruelty. The dolls were a mirror of his mind, a reflection of his obsession with observation, fear, and compliance. Each creation was a lesson in patience, subtlety, and psychological dominance. She realized that within this space, Nathaniel practiced a methodical form of evil, one that left no mark on the flesh but etched itself into the psyche. The dolls, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, whispered of control, manipulation, and the power of silence. And always, somewhere in the back of the workshop, Abigail felt the presence of the red door. It was a reminder that the most extreme experiments, the most profound secrets were still concealed. The dolls were only the beginning. Behind that door lay Nathaniel's ultimate work, the place where observation, cruelty, and ritual intersected with a precision that no one could anticipate, and from which no one returned unchanged. By the 4th month of Abigail's service, the estate had become a labyrinth of fear and subtle signals. The corridors, once merely hallways, had taken on a life of their own, echoing every misstep, every whispered thought, every falter of the heart. Servants moved as though under surveillance at all times, a constant awareness that even silence could betray them. Some nights, Abigail heard the faintest murmurs, indistinct, low, and never consistent, seeping from the walls themselves. It was impossible to tell if the sounds were real or a projection of anxious minds. Yet every whisper carried the same unmistakable message: watch yourself, obey, Look away from the red door." No one spoke openly about the disappearances. They were known, of course, but always in fragments. A servant not returning after an errand. A child sent to the Rowe estate never seen again. A delivery man who claimed he had delivered a package but could never leave the grounds. Abigail learned the delicate art of listening without listening, observing without being seen. The household had developed its own language of shadows and gestures. Small movements that communicated warnings. A hand brushing a sleeve, a tilt of the head, a barely perceptible blink. Even the youngest servant understood that survival required interpretation and that misreading a signal could be fatal. Nathaniel's presence was always quiet, yet it filled every corner. He appeared suddenly, sometimes in doorways, sometimes at the end of hallways, moving without announcement, yet always in perfect rhythm with the servants' routines. He never raised his voice. Reprimands came in the weight of his gaze, the subtlest arching of an eyebrow, a pause that froze the air. Servants would freeze mid-step, holding a dust cloth or a tray of silverware, aware that a single misalignment could be noted and remembered. It was not punishment in the physical sense. It was the psychological mark, invisible yet indelible. Fear became a tool, sharpened daily, an instrument that Nathaniel wielded with exacting precision. Whispers in the hallways grew more intense on certain nights, particularly when a storm rolled over the hills. Rain clattered against the windows, the wind pressed against the walls, and the house seemed to pulse with hidden activity. Abigail would catch glimpses of figures moving behind closed doors, shadows flickering at the corners of her vision. The older servants spoke in hushed tones about nights when people vanished into the walls, a phrase that made Abigail shiver without fully understanding. There was an unspoken hierarchy even in disappearance. Some were gone temporarily, forced into isolation to test fear and obedience. Others never returned, their absence serving as a grim warning to those left behind. Abigail began noticing subtle patterns. Certain servants were always assigned the same tasks at the same times. Routes through the house mapped not for efficiency but for observation. She saw that Nathaniel occasionally lingered in doorways, watching not the work itself but the reactions. The speed of movement, the faltering of hands, the tension in shoulders. Each micro-expression was recorded mentally, catalogued, and later reflected in the dolls or in the intricate instructions he left behind. Even the whispers themselves, Abigail realized, were a product of methodical cultivation. Fear propagated, reinforced by shared rumor, amplified in hushed conversations, feeding the precise environment Nathaniel desired. A sudden disappearance of a young maid named Eleanor deepened the house's unease. She had been late returning a silver tray from the dining hall. Abigail had glimpsed her, hesitation in the hallway, noticed a small tremor in her hands, a fleeting glance toward the red door. By evening, Eleanor had vanished. No trace remained. The servants whispered that she had looked too long, questioned too quietly. Nathaniel never mentioned the incident, yet the entire household absorbed its lesson. Fear was not accidental, it was engineered. Compliance was not natural, it was mandatory. Every footstep in the hallways, every hushed word, every glance toward the forbidden door carried weight and consequence. By the end of the chapter, Abigail understood that the whispers were not just rumors or imagined sounds. They were tools of control. They were the echo of Nathaniel's design, the unseen fingers of his mind stretching through corridors and chambers, touching every inhabitant of the estate. Obedience was no longer voluntary. It was embedded in thought and breath. The red door remained at the far end of the main hallway, untouched, unbroken, and infinitely forbidding. It had become both symbol and instrument, a focus for the anxiety, curiosity, and silent terror that Nathaniel cultivated with painstaking care. The house, Abigail realized, was alive, not in the way a building can creak or settle, but in the sense of being governed by an intelligence far older, far more deliberate than any mortal presence. Every whisper, every shadow, every disappearance served a precise purpose, and at the center of it all stood Nathaniel Rowe, calm, attentive, and invisible in his omniscience. Fear was his medium, obedience to his art. And behind the red door, the true measure of his methodical cruelty waited, patient, secret, and absolute. The estate had settled into a rhythm of silence so deliberate it felt almost tangible. Each servant moved with care, not only in task but in thought. Abigail had begun to notice that the quiet was not simply the absence of sound. It was structured, almost ritualistic, designed to heighten awareness, to enforce vigilance. Every step, every breath, every minor adjustment of posture was noted, either by another servant or, more dangerously, by Nathaniel himself. The house had become a map of behavioral patterns, and every resident a point on a grid he monitored with meticulous attention. Nathaniel's genius lay in the invisibility of his surveillance. He did not rely on shouting or physical punishment. He observed the minute irregularities, the way a hand lingered too long on a doorknob, the slight hesitation before lifting a tray. The tremor in a smile meant to mask nervousness. Abigail learned to read these signs in one another, to predict danger from body language, the rhythm of footsteps, the slight stutter of a voice. It was a web, delicate yet unbreakable, spun from fear and attentiveness. The red door remained at the center of this web, a constant reminder of the ultimate unknown. In the afternoons, Nathaniel would often retreat to his study, where the windows were drawn tight and the walls lined with stacks of paper and journals. These were not ordinary records. They were meticulous accounts of human behavior. Each servant had a profile, patterns of obedience, reactions to stress, moments of hesitation. Abigail glimpsed one such journal once, a faintly illuminated page showing sketches of hands, careful notes on eye movements, and precise recordings of speech cadence. It was as if he had dissected thought itself, reducing it to measurable, manipulable data. The pattern extended beyond the individual to the household as a whole. Nathaniel had arranged tasks so that people crossed paths at specific points, each meeting a calculated opportunity to observe reactions. Silence was enforced not only by instruction but by the anticipation of observation. The servants moved like dancers on an invisible stage, each step choreographed by fear and the need to remain unnoticed. The smallest deviation, an extra glance toward the red door, a whisper shared too openly, could ripple outward, registering in Nathaniel's mind, later reflected in his dolls, in his instructions, or in the fate of those who faltered. Abigail began to recognize subtle signals among the servants, small gestures that conveyed warning without words. A flick of the wrist, the tilt of a head, the slight repositioning of an object. These were the threads of the patterns of silence, They were methods of survival, but also mechanisms of further control, reinforcing Nathaniel's unseen authority. Each servant was both observer and observed, caught in a perpetual loop of anxiety and compliance. In this system, silence was power, and speech or even thought carried risk. The fear of disappearance hung over the household like a dense fog. Abigail noticed that when someone failed to comply fully, the silence deepened around them, a collective pressure that communicated the consequences without a word. Occasionally, small incidents punctuated the tension: a missing shoe, a tray slightly misaligned, a servant lingering too long at a door. Nathaniel did not react openly. Instead, he adjusted the pattern, moving people subtly, shifting responsibilities, altering routes, as if the house itself had become an extension of his mind. The invisible architecture of fear was perfected daily, sculpted by meticulous observation, and reinforced through the patterns of silence. Yet even as the system tightened, there was an undercurrent of curiosity Abigail could not suppress. The red door, looming and forbidden, called to every thought she tried to banish. She noticed that Nathaniel sometimes lingered near it, even when alone, as though it held more than just a secret room. It was a threshold, a promise of ultimate knowledge and control. The patterns of silence, the careful choreography of fear, the meticulous records of behavior, all converged on that door. It was the heart of the experiment, the place where observation, manipulation, and cruelty would achieve their purest expression. By the end of the week, Abigail understood the full weight of the system. The patterns of silence were not incidental. They were deliberately constructed, a lattice of control, an unseen prison that bound mind to mind, body to fear. Nathaniel's methods were invisible, precise, and devastatingly effective. In every shadow, in every measured pause, the house itself became a warning. Obedience was not merely expected, it was demanded, enforced, and cultivated in ways beyond the imagination of those outside. The red door, ever watchful, remained the ultimate test of will, the silent instrument of his unbroken authority and the locus of all his methodical hidden cruelty. It began with a missing tray. Mildly alarming at first, Abigail had assumed that Eleanor, a younger servant, had simply forgotten to return it to the kitchen. But when she checked the corridor where Eleanor should have passed, the hallway was empty. There were no hurried footsteps, no faint echo of movement, only silence so thick it pressed against the ears. Abigail paused, listening, hoping to hear the clatter of utensils or the shuffle of shoes. There was nothing. It was as if Eleanor had evaporated into the walls themselves. The other servants were slower to notice, bound as they were to their routines, their focus on the meticulously timed movements Nathaniel demanded. Yet by mid-morning, whispers had begun circulating. "Did you see Eleanor?" one would murmur, careful not to raise a tone that might attract attention. "She was just here," another replied, voice low, hesitant. The words carried tension, a silent acknowledgement that the house had shifted, that an absence had begun to fill the space as much as presence had once dominated it. Abigail's unease grew. She remembered the small tremor in Eleanor's hands days earlier, a fleeting glance toward the red door. She tried to dismiss it as coincidence, yet the image haunted her. Fear, she realized, was cumulative, layering itself upon the mind in subtle increments. Nathaniel's methods worked slowly, invisibly, like water carving grooves in stone. Each hint, Each observation, each unspoken warning had contributed to the preparation for this disappearance. The household had become an intricate machine of anticipation, tension, and control, and Eleanor was the first piece to be removed. No one dared question Nathaniel. He appeared that afternoon calm and deliberate, his gaze sweeping across the servants with the same measured precision he applied to his dolls. No word of Eleanor passed his lips. He did not inquire about her work or offer a reason for her absence. Abigail noted the subtle twitch in his hand as he turned a page in a ledger. It was enough. The message was clear. The disappearance was intended, and inquiry was neither necessary nor tolerated. Fear of the unknown had achieved its objective. The servants fell into patterns of muted anxiety. Tasks were performed with greater exactness. Movements slowed and exaggerated in caution, eyes darting nervously toward the forbidden door. Abigail observed the smallest changes, a curl of a finger, a twitch of an eyebrow, the minuscule pause before opening a shuttered window. It was as if the absence of Eleanor had carved a void that was filled by hyper-awareness, collective vigilance, and silent dread. The house became a mirror reflecting the anticipation of punishment, the omnipresence of observation, and the pervasive weight of unspoken consequences. Abigail began to see the dolls differently now. Nathaniel's creations were not merely studies, they were rehearsals, maps of behavior that guided the structure of the household. Eleanor's disappearance mirrored a figure he had sculpted weeks earlier, a study in hesitation and fear. Abigail shivered as she noticed how the doll's expression, frozen yet precise, captured the subtle panic she had glimpsed in Eleanor. Nathaniel's cruelty was not improvisational. It was premeditated, calculated, and executed with the same methodical patience he applied to the smallest details in the workshop. By evening, the household had settled into a new, rigid rhythm. Eleanor's absence was a silent presence, observed but unspoken. Abigail felt the tension accumulate in the narrow corridors, felt it in the careful steps of her companions, in the hushed exchanges of glances, in the collective restraint that now defined every interaction. Each task became an exercise in vigilance, each footstep a test of composure. Nathaniel did not need to enforce obedience through threats. The disappearance itself was enforcement. Abigail understood finally that the red door symbolized the ultimate boundary between knowledge and terror, between control and chaos. Eleanor had crossed it, not physically perhaps, but psychologically. Nathaniel had orchestrated not merely her removal, but the complete absorption of fear into the household, transforming uncertainty into a tangible guiding force. The dolls, the whispers, the meticulous observations, all led to this moment. Eleanor's disappearance was the first demonstration of a system perfected over months. Fear cultivated, measured, and weaponized with devastating effect. As Abigail prepared to leave the hallway that evening, she caught the faintest shift in the shadows near the red door. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, yet it carried intent. It reminded her that the house itself was alive with observation, that the disappearance was not an anomaly but a rehearsal. A single note in the symphony of control Nathaniel had composed. And somewhere behind that door, the ultimate experiment awaited, silent and patient, ready to unfold with precision and inexorable cruelty. After Eleanor's disappearance, the estate no longer felt like a house. It had become a pressure chamber, each corner a calculated trap for the mind. Abigail noticed how the remaining servants began to mirror one another instinctively. Movements were copied, gestures repeated, expressions refined to match a collective expectation. It was not mimicry for comfort, it was mimicry for survival. Every subtle twitch, every careful alignment of a tray, every precise pause before stepping into a hallway became a measure of safety, an unconscious attempt to align with the invisible standard Nathaniel imposed. Nathaniel's approach was not one of overt punishment, but of quiet calibration. He would watch a servant for days, noting the minutest hesitation, the almost imperceptible shiver in his shoulder, the split-second falter in a smile. Then, without a word, he would adjust their tasks, subtly shifting positions, alternating routes through the hallways, creating opportunities to observe anew. Abigail realized that obedience was not demanded through threat. It was sculpted, built with deliberate incremental nudges. Each correction was a whisper, each adjustment a lesson, each observed reaction a proof of control. The mirrors of obedience extended beyond physical actions. Abigail noticed that even thoughts seemed to bend under the weight of expectation. Servants would anticipate Nathaniel's presence, predict what would please or displease him, and modify internal reactions before a single word was spoken. Fear had become anticipatory, lodged in the mind before any punishment could be administered. Nathaniel had engineered the house not only to observe behavior, but to cultivate it, to shape cognition itself. The red door was the silent axis around which this transformation turned, a forbidden center that pulled the household toward a singular focus: survival through perfect conformity. Small rituals emerged among the servants, almost imperceptible, as if the patterns of obedience demanded their own reinforcement. A brush of the sleeve across a dusted table, a precise alignment of silverware, the careful closing of shutters in timed sequence. All became part of a system designed to channel anxiety into structured action. Abigail recognized that the rituals themselves were neither protective nor comforting. They were exercises in control, reflections of Nathaniel's omnipresent gaze. Each repetition confirmed the boundaries. Each small compliance reinforced the architecture of terror. Even as she adapted, Abigail sensed the growing fracture among the household. Some servants became hyper-focused, meticulous in their adherence to the invisible rules, their eyes scanning, their postures rigid. Others faltered, distracted by doubt, by memory, by the impossibility of total compliance. These lapses were small but significant. Nathaniel did not intervene immediately. Instead, the mirrors reflected their own failures back at them, magnifying them. A spilled tray, a misaligned chair, a lingering glance, all became silent indictments. Abigail watched as anxiety compounded, as nerves frayed, as obedience itself became a measure of mental endurance. Abigail began to see Nathaniel's true genius in the mirrors he had created. They were not mirrors of the body, but mirrors of the mind. He had trained the household to reflect the exact behaviors, exact expressions, and exact reactions he required. Each person became both observer and observed. Their fears echoed in the movements of others, their compliance verified through imitation. The system was self-reinforcing. Every act of imitation reinforced expectation. Every subtle hesitation exposed weakness. Every micro-expression recorded silently in Nathaniel's mind and journals. The red door remained at the end of the hallway, inert yet charged, a gravitational point around which all patterns revolved. Abigail felt its presence constantly, even when unseen, sensing that it was more than a barrier. It was a measuring device, an instrument to refine obedience and magnify fear. Behind it lay the culmination of Nathaniel's design, a space where compliance would be tested against the ultimate unknown, where the consequences of deviation would be absolute, and where the house itself would judge and shape the behavior of anyone who dared approach. By nightfall, the household had adapted to a new rhythm. Silence and observation were fully internalized. The mirrors of obedience reflected not only the fear of punishment, but the inevitability of disappearance. Abigail understood that this system was not accidental, not improvised, not reactive. Nathaniel had conceived it entirely, engineered it meticulously, and perfected it through months of incremental adjustment. Each gesture, each hesitation, each whispered thought had been accounted for and incorporated into the ongoing experiment. Fear had become method, compliance had become ritual, and the mirrors had become absolute. As she lay awake that night, listening to the faint creaks of the floorboards, Abigail realized the estate itself had become a living instrument of control. Nathaniel's genius lay not in physical domination, but in the orchestration of perception, in the shaping of thought, in the creation of silent, self-reinforcing mirrors of obedience. And somewhere beyond the red door, she knew, the ultimate lesson awaited, patient, inevitable, and final. The dolls had always been there, silent witnesses lined up on shelves, their painted eyes observing every action with unsettling exactness. But after Eleanor's disappearance, they took on a new significance. Abigail began to notice that Nathaniel did not treat them as toys or decorations. Each was carefully positioned, studied, and adjusted as if their postures, expressions, and placements were deliberate cues, signals for those who knew to see them. In them, the servants glimpsed not whimsy but calculation. Nathaniel's dolls were an extension of the household system of observation, a mirror of behavior with an unnerving precision. It began subtly. A doll's hand would point toward a drawer. A slight turn of its head would indicate a path to be followed or not followed. Abigail first noticed the alignment when she carried a tray through the hall. A doll seated at the corner of the stairwell seemed to tilt its head toward the forbidden red door. Instinctively, she paused, her pulse quickening, heart hammering against the invisible walls of fear Nathaniel had erected. It was not fear of the doll, but fear of the message it conveyed. The dolls had become instruments of psychological pressure, silent enforcers of observation and messengers of judgment. Nathaniel's method was meticulous. He would observe a servant for hours, then retire to the workshop to recreate them in miniature. Abigail recognized her own likeness among several dolls one evening, down to the curve of her shoulders and the angle of her head when tense. It was not flattering. It was precise, clinical, and inescapable. The dolls were not innocent. They were instruments of reflection, measuring fear, hesitation, and compliance. They recorded behavior in 3 dimensions, then projected it back into the room as subtle reminders that the eyes of the master were everywhere, and that nothing could escape scrutiny. The game escalated in intensity. Nathaniel would adjust a doll's position nightly, observing the servants' responses in the following hours. A glance too long at a doll, a twitch in the shoulder when passing, a whispered query about another's absence. Each became an observable metric. Abigail noticed that those who faltered under the scrutiny were treated differently. Tasks were shifted subtly. Routes through the house altered to maximize exposure to the dolls, placing the nervous under constant reflection. The dolls had become instruments of manipulation, shaping thought and motion, silently demanding obedience with the authority of their fixed, unblinking eyes. By midweek, the household had internalized the rules of the doll-maker's game. Servants mirrored the dolls' postures in fleeting micro-adjustments, subconsciously aligning their actions with the silent choreography Nathaniel dictated. Abigail felt the constant tension of surveillance, the weight of anticipatory fear, and the relentless focus of being measured in invisible increments. The dolls were not merely representations, they were extensions of Nathaniel himself, embodying the exact precision of his will, the unflinching assessment of his judgment, the cold certainty of his calculations. It was impossible to ignore the psychological implications. Abigail realized that the dolls were teaching more than obedience. They were teaching self-surveillance, turning the servants into both watchers and watches. They cultivated anxiety in a controlled form, refined awareness into a weapon, and transformed compliance into ritualized, unconscious practice. Nathaniel had created not merely a household, but a laboratory in which fear and reflection became interchangeable. Every glance, every step, every hesitation could now be read, measured, and replicated. The red door remained the silent center, the ultimate endpoint of the doll-maker's game. Abigail noticed that the dolls closest to it were altered more frequently, their positions ever shifting, their expressions ever more scrutinizing. She understood with a deepening chill that the door was both target and tool, the locus where the ultimate confrontation would occur. The dolls were preparation, rehearsal, and warning. They were instruments designed to condition, to manipulate, and to ensure that the unknown behind the red door would always be approached with perfect fear and attention. By nightfall, Abigail could feel the weight of the doll's gaze even when she was alone in her quarters. Each miniature figure was a fragment of Nathaniel's mind, a shard of his meticulous cruelty, and a silent reminder of the consequences of error. She realized the truth. The dolls were never innocent, and the game was far from complete. Compliance was not enough. Reflection, anticipation, and the constant mirroring of fear were required. And the red door waited, silent and inevitable, the final stage of the doll-maker's game, where observation, ritual, and terror would converge in ways the household could not yet imagine. The red door had always been silent, but after Eleanor's disappearance, its presence deepened. Abigail felt it first as a vibration, a subtle pressure in the air like a heartbeat muffled behind wood. At night, passing the corridor meant quickening steps and holding breath, for sometimes the silence broke. A murmur slipped through, low, indistinct, yet deliberate enough to freeze the blood. The servants pretended not to hear it. They quickened their pace, eyes fixed on the floor as though acknowledgement alone could mark them. But curiosity and terror grew together. Abigail noticed the way gazes lingered a moment too long, how shoulders stiffened near the door. The house had learned to feed them temptation, and Nathaniel allowed it. He did not need to order obedience. The whispers commanded it. The dolls amplified the effect. Those placed nearest to the red door were adjusted more often, their painted faces tilted just so, their eyes fixed on the threshold. Passing them felt like standing before a silent tribunal. Abigail swore they tracked movement, measuring hesitation with glassy precision. Nathaniel's experiment was unfolding in layers. The dolls recorded, the door whispered, and the servants supplied the fear. One afternoon, Thomas lingered too close. His hand brushed the wall beside the frame, his eyes drawn to the faint shimmer of its lacquer. The air shifted. Abigail, watching from the shadows, saw him stiffen as though a voice had slipped directly into his ear. His lips parted, trembling, before he staggered back, pale and shaking. He would not speak of what he heard, but his silence was its own confession. From then on, the whispers grew bolder. Abigail woke some nights to hear her own name carried, faintly on the air, not shouted but coaxed, as if urging her to approach. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound was inside, bypassing hearing and lodging itself in thought. Others muttered in their sleep, repeating phrases that made no sense, fragments borrowed from the unseen chorus behind the door. Absence became inseparable from the whispers. Eleanor's missing voice echoed in every conversation cut short, every gap at the table. The door seemed to gather these voids, weaving them into the murmurs that spread through the halls. Abigail realized the brilliance of Nathaniel's cruelty. The red door did not merely conceal horror, it weaponized uncertainty. Fear was not just felt, it was provoked, cultivated, and reflected back with surgical precision. She began to understand why Nathaniel never intervened. The servants' own minds were his instruments. Curiosity became disobedience, silence became complicity, and terror became the leash. The red door was not a secret chamber, but a psychological device, an axis around which the entire estate revolved. Its whispers measured loyalty, testing how long they could resist the temptation to know what waited inside. By week's end, the entire household had absorbed the lesson. No one spoke of the whispers, yet all obeyed their rhythm. Passing the door meant surrendering thought, quickening pace, burying curiosity. But Abigail knew the truth with a clarity that burned. The red door was alive in influence, if not in body, and its whispers were not warning them to stay away. They were calling, patient and insistent, waiting for the one who would finally open it. The key appeared one evening without explanation, resting on the hallway table where the servants could not ignore it. Small and ordinary in shape, it glimmered faintly in candlelight, carrying a weight beyond its metal. Abigail knew at once what it belonged to. Every servant did. The red door now had its counterpart, and the house seemed to thrum with anticipation. No one touched it at first. Passing the table meant tightening one's grip on a tray, forcing eyes away, pretending the object was no more significant than a spoon. But silence gave it power. The key spoke without sound, feeding temptation into the minds of those who had spent months avoiding the door. Nathaniel had not hidden it. He had offered it, daring someone to act. Abigail held it once briefly when no one watched. The cold pressed into her palm, sending a chill through her arm. Its surface bore faint engravings, symbols without meaning yet heavy with intent. She returned it quickly, heart pounding. But the impression remained long after, as if the key had burned its outline into her skin. It was not just an object, it was a test. The household changed under its presence. Curiosity and fear now battled openly in the servant's eyes. Clara lingered near the door one afternoon, the key trembling in her fingers. Abigail watched from the shadows as Clara's breath grew shallow, her gaze fixed on the lacquered surface. The dolls along the hall seemed to tilt, their painted eyes locked on her, judging. Clara recoiled before turning it, dropping the key back onto the table as though it had scorched her. She vanished days later, absorbed into the silence like Eleanor before her. Abigail understood then that possession of the key was itself exposure. To touch it was to declare curiosity, to reveal desire. Nathaniel needed no violence. He allowed the key to reveal weakness for him. The red door had always commanded obedience, but now it demanded choice. Curiosity became confession, and hesitation became proof of vulnerability. One night, unable to resist, Abigail approached the door with the key in hand. The house seemed to lean in with her, floorboards creaking under invisible weight. She slid the key into the lock. The click echoed down the hall, louder than thunder. Her breath caught as the whispers swelled into a chorus, urgent and close, pressing against her skull like hands. The lock turned easily, yet the door resisted as though it weighed more than its wood. Abigail froze. She felt the test for what it was. The door measured intent, gauging whether she moved from compulsion or surrender. The dolls lined behind her glimmered in candlelight, their glass eyes unblinking, their postures rigid, awaiting judgment. She withdrew at the last instant, pulling the key free with trembling fingers. The whispers subsided into a murmur, the house settling once more. She placed the key back on the table and retreated, shaken. But the message was clear. The red door was not simply meant to stay closed. It was meant to tempt, to lure, to expose the mind before it ever revealed its contents. By dawn, Abigail realized Nathaniel's perfection. He did not need to force them to open the door. The key ensured that eventually someone would. And when they did, the experiment would reach its end. The silence would break, and the truth behind the red door would be unleashed. The estate had grown quieter, though silence here was no comfort. It pressed on the servants like a weight, making every creak of the stair and every scuff of a shoe sound like warning. Speech dwindled to whispers, then to glances, as if words themselves might betray them. Absence filled the house more than presence. Eleanor was gone. Clara had followed. Their missing steps, their empty places at the table became louder than their voices ever were. Abigail noticed the change in how the others moved, slower, more rigid, as though they feared that the same silence would claim them next. The estate no longer felt alive with routine. It felt hollow, drained, haunted by gaps that could not be ignored. Nathaniel thrived in this atmosphere. He still glided through rooms with composure, smile intact, yet his journals filled faster than ever. Abigail glimpsed pages of strange sketches, hands trembling, eyes widened, notations about hesitations in posture. He was cataloging not just presence but absence, measuring how the house reshaped itself around the missing. To him, disappearance was not failure but data. The dolls mirrored this obsession. Some were now incomplete. Porcelain faces without eyes, limbs sculpted mid-motion, figures that seemed unfinished but were in fact deliberate. They embodied the vanished, frozen in gestures that suggested absence itself. Abigail felt a chill every time she passed them, as though they were memorials as much as instruments of control. The whispers spread further. They no longer stayed confined behind the red door. Abigail heard them at night in her quarters. Her name whispered faintly, a breath against her ear, though no one stood beside her. Servants muttered in their sleep, repeating fragments of words stolen from the unseen. Even waking hours carried distortion. Shadows moved in ways they should not, and silence seemed to bend into sound. The household unraveled. Thomas whispered constantly, replying to voices only he could hear. Margaret stared endlessly at the dolls, convinced they shifted when no one watched. Abigail herself felt her thoughts blur, memories slipping into doubts. She no longer trusted her senses, yet she knew that was the point. Nathaniel did not interfere. He only watched, documenting every fracture of the mind. She realized then the perfection of his cruelty. Pain left scars. Absence left nothing, and that void was far more corrosive. To vanish someone was to poison memory, to leave others to unravel under the weight of uncertainty. Fear no longer came from what Nathaniel might do, but from what he had already taken and how silence itself had become his most powerful weapon. By the end of the month, the estate was little more than a husk. Servants remained, but they moved like shadows, speaking rarely, thinking cautiously, anticipating disappearance with every step. The red door loomed larger than ever, not just as a forbidden threshold, but as a maw that consumed sound, faces, lives. The whispers behind it had grown louder, almost triumphant, as though absence itself had become Nathaniel's most enduring creation. Abigail understood at last. He did not need to kill them to destroy them. He only needed to let silence finish the work. The night was restless, wind clawing at the shutters as if the house itself stirred. Abigail could no longer resist. The key gleamed on the table, daring her to act. The whispers had grown unbearable, no longer faint but insistent, calling names, urging surrender. The red door seemed to pulse with life, its wood vibrating under unseen breath. She took the key, her fingers trembling. The hallway was lined with dolls, their glass eyes catching candlelight, stiff as witnesses awaiting judgment. Every step forward felt irreversible. When the key entered the lock, the click thundered through the corridor. The whispers swelled, pressing against her skull. She turned it, and the door groaned open. A wave of air poured out, metallic, thick, and chemical. Her candle trembled as the darkness beyond swallowed its light. Inside was no ordinary room, but a chamber larger than the house should have held. Its walls were lined with figures, not dolls, people. They stood or sat in grotesque tableau, villagers, servants, the vanished, even Eleanor. Their bodies were preserved, their skin pale as wax, their eyes glassy. Tubes and wires clung to them like veins, halting decay, simulating motion. Some twitched faintly, lips cracked, whispering fragmented words. Others were frozen mid-gesture, arranged as though in performance. It was not life nor death, it was obedience made eternal. Abigail staggered, bile rising in her throat. This was Nathaniel's true masterpiece. Every disappearance had been preparation, every doll rehearsal, every whisper a lure. He had not merely studied fear, he had sculpted it into permanence. These people were experiments made flesh, human behavior preserved, silence embodied, absence given form. At the chamber's center stood Nathaniel, calm as though waiting for her all along. His eyes gleamed with pride, his stillness a declaration. He did not need to speak. His work spoke louder than words. The red door had not concealed madness but method. This was a design, perfect in its cruelty. He had transformed obedience into artifact, fear into ritual, silence into immortality. The whispers grew deafening now, a chorus rising from the preserved figures. Names, pleas, fragments of prayer tumbled together into a suffocating murmur. Abigail pressed her hands to her ears, but the voices were inside, crawling into thought, binding her to their endless echo. She understood then the red door was not just a threshold, it was a conclusion. To enter was to be absorbed, catalogued, silenced forever. Her candle sputtered, plunging the chamber into a flickering twilight. Faces loomed in half-light, empty eyes, frozen mouths, whispers spilling endlessly from fractured throats. The truth struck with finality. The door was never meant to stay closed. It was meant to be opened, to reveal the perfection of cruelty so patient and deliberate it could not be undone. Abigail stepped back, but it was too late. The chamber had claimed her gaze, her breath, her fear. She was already part of it. Another figure drawn into the symmetry of Nathaniel's design. When the Rowe estate was finally breached, it looked unchanged from the outside. Stone walls, shuttered windows, a house like any other. But inside, investigators uncovered Nathaniel's chamber, his journals, his dolls, and his preserved victims. What had lived in whispers became undeniable fact. The red door no longer guarded mystery, it revealed atrocity. The world recoiled. Servant laws were revised, oversight enforced where silence once reigned. Memorials were raised for the vanished, though most families received no bodies to bury. Names were etched into stone, but the weight of absence lingered heavier than remembrance. Neighbors still lowered their voices at mention of the estate, as though Nathaniel's reach extended beyond death. His experiment had ended, yet its echo endured. Abigail's account, fragmented and fearful, described the whispers, the dolls, and the chamber of preserved lives. Scholars debated her words, but none denied their chilling consistency with what was found. To some, her testimony proved Nathaniel's brilliance as a manipulator. To others, it stood as evidence of evil refined to its purest form. Cruelty without spectacle, hidden behind civility. The estate itself was left to rot. Vines swallowed its walls, storms battered its roof. Yet locals swore the red door never decayed. Travelers spoke of faint tapping from within, or flickers of candlelight through cracks at night. Few dared to test it. Most kept their distance as though the silence still demanded obedience. Writers and philosophers later used the story as a warning. They argued that Nathaniel's legacy revealed something essential about human weakness. That evil need not roar to thrive. It could whisper. It could wait. It could turn silence itself into its most enduring weapon. The red door became a symbol not only of cruelty but of complicity, a reminder that fear of speaking out is often what allows horrors to grow unchecked. In time, the Rowe estate passed into legend, half history, half ghost story. Yet the weight it left behind remained real. Families remembered their missing. Scholars remembered the journals. The land remembered the silence. And those who studied the case asked themselves the same question Abigail had carried to her grave. Was the red door ever truly closed, or had it only shifted its form, waiting to be opened again in another place, another time? The final lesson was hauntingly clear. Evil rarely arrives in spectacle. It hides in patience, thrives in silence, and survives in obedience. Behind every locked door, behind every unspoken rule, the possibility lingers. And so the voice of the documentary closes with a question, heavy and unresolved. What do you think? Could this happen again?